And good evening, everyone, and welcome to Harambe. Tonight, we're talking the politics of race, and in particular, the political, psychological, and sociological ramifications of the controversial book, The Bell Curve. Our guest this evening comes to us from arguably the best postgraduate African-American studies program the world has to offer, our neighbors to the south, Temple University. He is Dr. Terry Kershaw, Associate Professor of African-American Studies and the Director of the Institute for Afrocentric Research. Dr. Kershaw, welcome to Harambe.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoy your stay.
I'm sure I will.
All right. For benefit of our viewers, Dr. Kershaw, who may not have read this book, who don't know of this book, why don't you share with us what the essence of this controversial book is?
Well, first off, I'd be very surprised if someone hasn't heard about this book. I mean, it's been plastered all over news magazines, talk shows. I mean, people have been talking about it for quite some time. But the book basically argues that there are different levels of intellectual capacity that certain groups of people have, and that those who have high levels of intellectual capacity should be performing certain kinds of jobs or fulfilling certain roles or functions in society, and those who are low levels should perform other kinds of jobs. And in particular, that resources that the society gives out in terms of money, in terms of programs, in terms of opportunities, should be based upon who can be successful and who cannot. And that is a direct function of intellectual capacity.
Now, this is not the first foray into the whole pseudoscience, some would call it, of race-based or genetic-based intelligence testing. Why don't you give us some background on previous research?
Well, there was work that was done by a couple of people in particular that stands out. Shockley, and Arthur Jensen during the late 60s, who talked about intelligence and how, genetically speaking, black folks were intellectually inferior to whites in America. And in general, not just America. And Stephen Jay Gould wrote a book entitled Mismeasure of Man, where he took to task the so-called scientists and scholars during the late 1800s, 1900s, who tried to argue that there was a genetic difference in terms of intellectual abilities as a way of justifying various kinds of policy decisions that were made or the social system that was in effect at that time, perpetuating racism and sexism. For example, Stephen Jay Gould talked about how people wanted to measure whether or not males were more intelligent than females, so what they would do is measure the size of the skull, making the assumption that if the skull is bigger, then the brain is bigger, and therefore the person is more intelligent. So they would take BBs and put it in skulls and count the BBs, and whichever skulls had the most BBs obviously was the bigger skull and therefore had the bigger brain, and therefore justified the position of men being over women or superior to women. Same thing in terms of race, blacks and whites. This whole notion of, first off, that one can measure intelligence and measure it in such a way that one can actually draw valid conclusions on it, and then to move from that to developing policies or even reinforcing certain kinds of interaction between groups. This is also, though, part and parcel to an understanding in society that there are certain groups in this society, some that are less preferred than others, that when you mix, for example, less preferred with more preferred groups, you tend to destroy those more preferred groups. So you want to keep them separate. So there needs to be a way that one can identify how these groups are separate. Of course, race is one way, and of course, gender is another way to do that. So the history in this country, in terms of this whole connection between intelligence and the genetic indicators of intelligence has a long history, and it's deeply rooted in trying to maintain social structures, social relationships, attitudes, values, and belief that help to serve as the foundation for this society, especially in terms of inequality, justification of inequality, justification of some people being successful and other people not being successful, and not only on an individual level, but on a group level, in terms of certain groups not being as successful as other groups. And that's a way of trying to move away from the structure of society and focus on deficiencies of the group or deficiencies of individuals.
And speaking of deficiencies, I mean, this may be a fundamental question or a simple question to a lot of people, but exactly what is intelligence, and Can it be measured?
That's a tough question. Intelligence. It seems to me that when we think of intelligence, that's a subjective concept in the sense that one makes an evaluation of a person in terms of are they intelligent or not intelligent, given their actions or maybe their use of language or their behavior or certain values that they hold. A very subjective kind of concept. The tests that are used, for example, are asking particular questions about maybe knowledge in particular areas or how one thinks through problems or comes to solutions without even taking into consideration, for example, that people have different learning styles. And in having different learning styles, that's not an indicator of a person not being intelligent, but that's an indicator that people have preferred ways of learning. And so looking at something abstractly and coming up with a meaning for it may not be my preferred learning style. It does not mean I don't have the capacity to learn. And as you can see, when you ask me about intelligence, and I talked a little bit about intelligence and capacity, I'm doing that because one of the things that Murray and Herrnstein did was to mix up intelligence and intellectual capacity.
Is there any difference between the two?
Oh, I think there is. I mean, if we talk about intelligence in the sense of what you know, or what you're able to do with material, for example, or how you understand things, or the way you understand them, that's a learned process for the most part. The capacity to learn is what can this person learn or how much this person can learn, not necessarily what this person knows. So I think there's a difference between what a person can learn or the ability of a person to learn versus what a person knows. And I think they mix that up quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. You know, Dr. Kershaw, in preparing for this program and researching it, I was amazed at the amount of materials and articles have been written. I think on the internet there were like thousands of articles written on it, as well as a number of books and magazines and the like. My question to you is this book predicated on good, solid science?
I don't think so. One way to think about good science is that one presents a balanced perspective so that the readers are able to assess the information and draw their own conclusion. Most of the sources that's used in this book are used to support the argument being made. And the brief mention of sources that challenge those arguments are just that brief. For example, I mentioned Stephen Gould's Mismeasure of Man. They had maybe a paragraph at most talking about Stephen Jay Gould and Mismeasure of Man as a challenge to this approach, but not necessarily showing how it challenged and where it was faulty in that challenge. I think that is pseudoscience because science should be about presenting information and letting people draw their conclusions, so you present both sides of the argument. I think pseudoscience also occurs when one mixes up the concepts, as I talked before, about intellectual capacity and intelligence. I think when one does that, it tends to confuse readers. Science should be not about the business of confusing, but should be about the business of enlightening, allowing people, again, to see what's there, as opposed to being told what's there and being told, in effect, what to believe and how to look at it. I think science also has to be very careful that it doesn't try to reinforce the common sense understandings of society because the common sense understandings of society are going to sell a book. Okay, they talk about, well, we challenge the taboo that society holds in terms of connecting intelligence to race or connecting intelligence to what a person can do for society. So they're attacking that and they're saying they're attacking a taboo. But I think they're doing more than just that. I think what they're doing is really trying to get people to reflect on the society in such a way as to not pose a challenge to the society. As to say, for example, well, look, there's inequality in society. Yes, we know certain groups of people are more unemployed than others. Certain groups of people have less income than others. Certain groups of people get less of a return on their education than others. But that's not society's fault. That's not our fault. That's their fault. That's, to me, that typical argument of blaming the victim.
And you're touching on something that I'm hitting in, and that is the political ramifications. Okay, there's a lot of things that are happening in our country right now. All kinds of legislation and cutbacks, welfare reform, affirmative action is under attack, welfare mothers and the like, and that sort of thing. The types of things that Herrnstein and his cohort got into in the book.
Right.
What are the political ramifications of the bell curve, or are there any?
Yeah. Oh, I think there are tremendous political ramifications, especially if we put it in a context, because it seems to me one has to always look at society in a context. If we put it in a context, and one of the major issues that people are dealing with now is the budget. Okay, where is the money going? We're in a deficit. How are we going to pay for the future? We're giving all of this money to people who really don't need it, or are using it as a crutch, and therefore we need to move away from that and put money in other areas. Okay, you have, for example, certain groups of people who are arguing for the industry, private industry, to take control over a lot of these programs, because private industry will decide what's in their best interest, which is to maximize profit. So they will select the most qualified person. And in doing that, then naturally what will happen is that those people who are most qualified, regardless of race, color, gender, class, whatever it might be, are going to be successful in this society. So government doesn't need to get involved. We don't need to be raising issues about previous discrimination and trying to do something about previous discrimination. What needs to happen is we need to understand that certain people just don't have what it takes. And no matter what we do, they don't have what it takes. So if I'm a policymaker and I believe that certain people just don't have what it takes, why then would I support giving money to education programs to help, quote unquote, uplift people? Why would I have programs, for example, that try to provide for the quote-unquote economically and educationally disadvantaged, because there's no hope for them?
It sounds almost, Dr. Kershaw, like we are suggesting that there are throwaway people,
right,
a segment of our society that are
right,
dispensable.
And if not dispensable, because I don't want to do them a disservice, they may not necessarily say throwaway people, but I think what they may be moving towards, and what I see them moving towards, is that there are people who can do the dredge work of society, and that we shouldn't feel bad about that. That even though we believe in equal opportunities and this notion of equality, we need to understand that everyone is not equal. So there are certain roles and functions that need to be performed in society that should not be performed by the bright people, by the gifted people, by the intelligent people. So those people need to do it, these other people, and we don't need to try to train them to become lawyers and doctors and Indian chiefs, because they're never going to be able to do that. So it's in our best interest, as they would argue, to have those people do the things that they're capable of doing, which is the lower level kinds of jobs.
Now the question becomes now to all of our young people, particularly African Americans, Latino, who really have been very much disparaged in the rhetoric of the bell curve. What kind of psychological impact is this kind of rhetoric or pseudoscience going to have on our young people?
Well, it can have a tremendous effect on them. It can have, I think, one of two general kinds of effect. One, it can be one where people say, I'm not like that, and I will prove that I'm not like that. Okay, that's one way to go. Another way to go, and I think which tends to be the way that the majority goes, is to internalize that belief system about them and begin to look at themselves, what's referred to as a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I continually tell you that no matter what you do, you're not going to make it at this level, you'll only make it at this level.
Such as tracking within our education
system. Such as tracking
system.
is in the educational system, exactly. If I, for example, track you in a college prep system that says, okay, I'm going to teach you how to be a critical thinker, how to be able to look at abstract phenomena and make sense out of it, how to be a constructive member of the society, a productive member of society, a leader in society, then you're going to look at yourself that way. And there's a tremendous amount of research on this. If I tell you, for example, that, well, you're never really going to make much of yourself in this society, you probably need to go and get yourself a skill. You probably need to go to vocational school. You probably need to go and learn how to fix things. You get placed in classes in a curriculum that tries to teach you how to fill out job applications, how to accept authority, how to relate to authority, how to be a follower as opposed to a leader. Now, if I'm sitting in that classroom and everyone around me is being taught the same thing, and I see myself with this group, I begin to identify with that group. As a matter of fact, not only do I identify with that group, I'm also intimidated to compete with you, who is a member of the other group, because I really can't make it. Now, when I decide, okay, I might want to compete, I want to see if I can go to college, and I go to college and I wind up getting a 1.5, 1.8. After 1 year, 2 years, I have to leave college because I haven't been able to maintain the minimum requirements. I begin to say, well, maybe they're right. And maybe the only thing in life I can do is to go and work at this job or that job, or to just try to take it day by day and make it in the society. So I think psychologically it has a tremendous effect on the creativity that people have. It has a tremendous effect, I think, on people's willingness to challenge, to push themselves. It has a tremendous effect not only on the individual but on society. Because if you think about it, how many people do we lose then that can make positive contributions to society because they never think they can, no one gives them an opportunity to do it, and then they hear on Nightline, McNeil Lehrer, they see on the cover of Newsweek, the cover of Time, they hear everybody talking about, yeah, they do have less of an intellectual capacity, and we have evidence to prove that.
So if I hear what you're saying, implicit in what you're saying is, don't believe the hype, believe in yourself.
Right.
And Dr. Kershaw, we're going to have to take a break right here because we're going to give our viewers a chance to test their knowledge once again with this monthly edition of Black Facts. Stay with us. And we welcome you back to Harambe. Our guest this evening is Dr. Terry Kershaw, Professor of African American Studies at Temple University. And Dr. Kershaw, I recently had the opportunity to interview Dr. Andrew Hacker, the author of the very popular book, Two Nations, and Dr. Yosef Ben-Jekinen. You know, and I asked Dr. Hacker, Professor of Political Science and author of the bestseller, Two Nations, Black, White, Separate, Hostile, and Unequal, about the current state of race relations. And I also had the opportunity to ask Dr. Yosef Ben-Jekinen, noted Egyptologist and scholar, about his response to the bell curve. And here's what they had to say about that. Check it out.
Well, interestingly, you use the phrase race relations. I don't think there are many relations between black and white people. What I would say very simply is that those of us who are born with this pigmentation have certain privileges, things we can take for granted. You know, we have the safety, the security, so we don't want to lose this. Now, this also means that, and here's the unpleasant part, that so much of our safety, security, status comes from putting down black people, saying we're not like them. We're Europeans. We're more highly evolved. You know, we've got talents they don't have. And that's where you get, you know, the flip side of this, which really is the ugly side of racism. And as I kept emphasizing, the fear is here. We are the dominant part of the population. And yet the real fear that we have of black people goes very deep. And you'd be amazed, you know, I'd say this to you, maybe you wouldn't be amazed at how much we talk about you when you're not there. Again and again, we keep going on about crime and drugs and babies, you know, and guns and so on, as if, you know, it's driving us up the wall, but we have to keep on worrying and worrying and worrying.
What do you make of this bell curve, in Charles Murray's bell curve?
I ignore it. There's some things I ignore because what I'm going to do to Charles Murray or anyone who feel like them, in spite of all the facts that are going down, why am I going to worry about the bell curve? I can say, all right, the bell curve was still there when the Africans built a pyramid. It was there when they give the world mathematics. It was there when they give the world science. It was there when we make the first calendar. Is there anything more?
As you noted, I got a kick out of what he said. He was quite animated. But, you know, that points out a real irony, Dr. Kershaw. I mean, what we have are scholars who are basically trying to document the inherent inferiority of African people when history proves that the very tenets of education, the liberal arts, the sciences and mathematics and the like, all have their origins in the Nile Valley African civilizations. How do you respond to that kind of mentality?
Well, you know, first off, those who challenge that do not necessarily agree that the Egyptians were Africans. Okay, that's the first way.
They were the black-skinned whites
that they try. They try not to even talk about them as black-skinned. Okay, that's the first way that they approach that. But I think it's important for us to understand the significance of what's being said there. And I think it also brings into account the notion of, again, intellectual capacity and what is meant by intelligence in a particular society. It's clear, for example, in terms of if one does research and go back and check, that we have, as African people, made significant contributions to the world. It doesn't mean that others haven't built on those contributions, but we have made significant contributions to the world. And so for me, it becomes very obvious that it is an attempt to try to maintain social relations as they are, especially given the challenge of something like Afrocentrism that talks about going from the center of African people and beginning to look at their role in the world as active participants and not passive participants, that in order to meet that challenge, one must then begin to raise questions about whether or not these people are even intellectually our equal. And so it seems to me that it is an attempt to try to politically maintain a political relationship, psychologically to maintain a psychological relationship, and sociologically to maintain a sociological relationship of them and us, more preferred, less preferred. And if we think about it, it goes back quite a bit to this whole notion of the vertical development of culture, okay, which we can find as being a prevalent idea during the Enlightenment period, and this notion of social Darwinism, the strong will survive. And so in looking at that, and being able then to go out and dominate the world technologically, to be able to impose their will on others, there has to be a way of justifying the enslavement of a certain group of people, especially if one calls themselves a Christian. Especially if one talks about placing God at the center of their lives and then they go out and enslave another human being, there has to be some way of rationalizing that and justifying that without tearing down the very fabric of society. So one way in America of trying to justify the way America is in terms of certain groups being denied certain opportunities, certain groups, for example, historically and contemporarily being denied not only opportunities, but being denied their full humanity, being denied opportunities to be human, is to talk about their inherent inferiority. Because if I talk about their inherent inferiority, then it's not my fault that you're inferior. That's on you. And I'll do what I can to help you, but I can only do so much. So it becomes a justification, a rationalization for capitalism, for exploitation, for racism, for sexism, for a dominance in the world, for this notion of a manifest destiny. It becomes justification, rationalization to maintain a particular way society and the world is organized.
You know, time is very much of the essence, Dr. Kershaw. You mentioned to Dr. Asante, I talked to him yesterday, and I was calling him because I wanted to know, I said, Dr. Asante, who would be an excellent resource for a future show that I'd like to do on Harambe on the whole race classification. I mean, who is the turkey who created this phenomenon of race classification? Sometimes I think it's the worst thing that ever happened to humankind, is this race-based classification. And he quickly said, Kershaw. I said, well, that brother's going to be in the studio tomorrow. He said, well, that's your man. Anything related to race. Briefly, where did this race thing when did it come into being?
Well, if you talk about classification of groups of people, I think that's gone on for some time. But classifications are based on different criteria. Classification in terms of geography, classification in terms of culture, classification in terms of gender, in terms of class, and things like that. Classification in terms of race, I don't know if you can point a finger at a particular person who did that. I mean, there were a lot of people who were involved in that. For example, Bishop Bartholomew Las Casas, during the 1500s, when Europeans were coming over and colonizing North America, South America, and the Caribbean, were using Native Americans, Indians at that time, and enslaving them to do the work that they wanted done. Bishop Las Casas talked about this whole notion of these are noble people, these red men, and they're being destroyed by our diseases. We need to get another group of people to bring in here, and he pointed out the Africans, because the Africans were abundant, were used to large-scale agriculture, were not susceptible to European diseases, so now let's use them. And as you use them, there's got to be some way that you can keep them in the situation they're in, because you don't want to keep freeing and getting more, freeing and getting more. You want to start breeding, and you want to start keeping.
So they use this whole notion, and excuse me for cutting you off, to justify the enslavement of Africans. Right. And I have to cut you off, Dr. Kershaw. Right. I have to tell you, it's been so much of a pleasure to have you here in our studio tonight, and we're going to have to get you back up here again. But we are out of time, literally. Some people would say that this is the greatest book ever written in the world. This is the Bible. And in the future, you can look forward to seeing Dr. Kane Hope Felder, a religious scholar whose expertise is in the area of blacks in the Bible, right here on Harambe. That's all we have time for tonight. Good night, everybody.